Hey, it's Paul. On this week's episode of the podcast, Sonya and I segue off of the Prince Harry and Princess Meghan interview to sort of talk about some of the similarities that we have. I mean, we're not royalties, but we are an interracial couple. And then we talk about what it's been like for us to sort of go through our lives, first as dating and then married and now with kids, how I interpret the Black experience, why Sonya and I both feel that, I should be doing this book about Birmingham and about these civil rights leaders right now, and how it's in some ways a way to honor our kids, how it's in some ways a way to honor Martin Luther King's legacy. So if you like this episode, rate and review it. If you want to get in touch with me, as always, the best way to do so is through paulkicksnewsletter.com. But for right now, let's get right into it. Hey, Sonya, how are you?
Hello, Paul.
So we watched, like millions of others, the Harry and Meghan Markle interview. Sonya, what did you think of it?
Meghan and Harry.
Fine, Meghan and Harry.
Better. Thank you.
Quite a 2-hour spectacle.
It was amazing.
And we wanted to talk this week about kind of us, right? Because we do have, we're not royalties, but we do have some similarities to them insofar.
Definitely, some of the things that they talked about definitely touched some sensitive areas, like in our own journey together.
Yeah, Harry talked for me. I'll just speak for myself. Harry talked a lot about the things that he had to try to learn, just like coming to date a woman who's biracial, who identifies as Black. He's coming from a very royal perspective. My own background is a very rural one, but the commonality there, it's there, right? Like, we both had to learn what it means to fall in love with somebody whose experience is vastly different from our own and whose life experiences are vastly different from our own.
Here's something that I always thought was really amazing about what they said, and I think something very similar to our own story. They fell in love with each other without, I think, a real understanding of the other's experience, like his experience as a royal, her experience as a Black woman. I didn't have any concept of what it meant to come from rural Iowa after living on a farm, and you certainly.
I had no concept of what it meant to come from Fifth Ward in Houston.
Yeah,
no.
You didn't.
Yeah.
You didn't know that.
So how does this tie in with the book? Well, it ties in with the book, I think, because certainly after the kids were born, I became fascinated with the civil rights movement and the Birmingham campaign, primarily because the Birmingham campaign, I felt, set off everything else that followed, right? March to Selma, March to Washington, even King's martyrdom. The Birmingham campaign is the catalyst for all of that. And without the Birmingham campaign, you could make an argument that perhaps nothing that follows it actually does follow. So I began to focus more and more on the Birmingham campaign. But I also just began to focus, and you and I talk a fair amount about this. We are perhaps unique among some Americans because we are truly the descendants of Martin Luther King's dream, right? Right. You are a little Black girl, I am a little white boy, and we joined our hands in love, and we are raising a family. That's what he wanted in 1963, and here we are in 2021, and we have that, right? Mm-hmm. We've got 3 kids of our own. Our lives are, of course, nowhere near what those guys had to go through in the civil rights era. They have their own struggles, but I wanted to write this book in some way almost to honor that vision. And I think what do you think we should talk about this episode? Because you have some pretty strong opinions of how we should go about this.
Of course I do. Of course I do. One question that came up over and over again as you were pitching this book, was how does a white man have any authority to be able to speak about the Black experience?
Yeah.
So I, as your partner, I've obviously seen you learn more about what it means. You're basically the head of a Black family.
Not basically, I am.
You are.
Yeah.
Except, I'm charged.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
So I would love to know, how you see that kind of evolution as the rural farm boy who lived in a very, very small town
Mm-hmm.
to, your experience today, someone who lives the experience every day.
Yeah, so I think maybe the best place, like, I think it probably starts when we were dating, right? Um, I I didn't have any real perception of what it meant to. I didn't really have a great perception of what the black experience was until we started to date. Uh, I mean, Michael Jordan's my favorite basketball player, but like that's about
superficial.
it. It's
That's
superficial.
Completely superficial.
Yeah,
And not at all
and
relevant. But I mean, by the same token, I didn't know I didn't know what it was like to be a farmer.
no,
I had no concept of that other than Willie Nelson. I liked
Yeah.
Willie Nelson.
Well, let's start with actually our own courtship then, right? Like, did you find it at all strange to be dating a white guy? I didn't find it strange at all to be dating a black person. What I did have to grow accustomed with is the black experience, and I think that those are actually two distinct things. I'm curious for like, did you see it the same way too? Like, is dating a white guy different than the white experience for you, or no?
I mean, I think that I think any black person living in America lives the white experience. I mean, you have to by default
Yeah,
because
that's
that is
true.
the experience.
Yeah.
So you came home to meet my family, and hopefully you felt very comfortable with my family. But also, what was interesting is that my family is a very working class family, and you found commonalities
Oh,
that
completely.
went way beyond race.
Yeah, in fact, I feel like I was welcomed in your house because that sort of working class environment was what I had known on the farm, right? Different races, completely different experiences, but in terms of class, we came from similar backgrounds.
Right. Right.
And that was easy. So like when I went to visit your grandma Teresa at her house, it felt like visiting my grandma Melba, right?
And vice versa when I went to visit, your family. And I think neither of us approached our courtship from a position of race. We approached it, I think, much like Meghan and Harry, just two people sharing commonalities and learning about each other and their families, and falling in love. And so when she says, I didn't know what to expect, I believed what he told me. I mean, what you told me versus actually going to Iowa for the first time and driving to the farm versus you, coming to Houston with me, going into my grandmother's neighborhood, seeing that light, it's different. So
I mean, yeah, to bring it back to broaden it from the black, you're dating a black woman to beginning to understand the black experience. It was at Teresa's house, right? And sort of in Fifth Ward itself, where I began to understand what that black experience is, right? You see the ways in which, just to start, the ways that the freeways had divided up Houston and torn apart this great neighborhood that was Fifth Ward, right? You see the ways in which certain neighborhoods are left to be dilapidated.
No, you see it.
You see it. And I remember not too long after we started dating, there was Hurricane Katrina, right?
Yep.
And do you remember, I don't know if you remember this, I certainly do. We were watching some benefit, and Kanye West said something like, George Bush doesn't like black people.
He doesn't care about black people.
Doesn't care about black people. And he was standing next to Mike Myers as he said it. And I remember that being like a switch in my head, because you said something to the effect of damn right. And at first I was like, Kanye's, if I were not dating you, I perhaps would have been thinking, well, is he just doing this for some sort of attention, Kanye? I mean, he does a lot of stuff for attention,
Yeah.
but that's what that was. And Mike Myers was actually kind of like, he was uncomfortable up there in that moment. But that's when I began to, for whatever reason, that's a moment that sticks out for me, because that's when I was like, yes, George Bush does not understand black people. I'm beginning to understand black people, because by that point, that's 2005. We had been dating for a couple of years, well, a year and a half by that point. And just being around you and talking with you and understanding what it's like, your own upbringing, some of the challenges that you faced, in your
Well,
own childhood.
So Kanye, when he said that, that was, I think, a culmination of just so much anxiety and anger and frustration at what I think every person of color for sure, and I'm from Houston, I have family in Louisiana, like seeing the lines and like the lack of priority for people that it could be my grandmother sitting there. And so I think what was so interesting is that you and I have been looking at these images on TV for I can't even tell you how long. And
at least a few days by that point.
And so we decided I lived right by the convention center
in Dallas.
So all these people were being bussed in.
Yep.
And I remember going down there and
from New Orleans, just to make it clear. Yeah.
Yes, from New Orleans. I remember us walking down there and going to the convention center and walking in, and then I remember my expectation from the news was just like this overwhelming sense of depravity and like how awful it would be. And here you have people that are like, me, my family, like anyone, like people who are just displaced, like people are on their phones, they have jobs, and like they're trying to like figure out how to do their daily lives and just in the middle of this chaos. And it made me realize right then and there how the media had done this job in framing these, all these majority of Black people, framing us as this very like impoverished.
I even think that like some people were using words like almost like animals. Like it was some pretty horrific language.
It was, and we went down there. It was like people were incredibly friendly.
Yeah.
It was just like going to the mall, for lack of a better. It was just like people were just confused and they were trying to figure out what they needed. Like people were bringing in all these resources and clothes, and people were just like, you know what I mean? Like it was just like.
And it took, so from my perspective, that trip is where, again, seeing Fifth Ward, talking with you every day, understanding your own life experiences, but then sort of broadening out and seeing these people who were displaced from New Orleans and displaced and discarded because of the color of their skin. That was a weekend where I was like, oh, now I'm beginning to really understand the Black experience.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. What they failed to mention, African Americans of all socioeconomic classes were displaced.
Yeah.
And I think what, someone who is African American, who is, middle class, definitely had a harder time getting through this as opposed to someone who I think is white and middle class. And I think maybe in my mind, that was probably the first time that such the huge disparity that can exist, in two different narratives of the same story. I felt like that was probably the first time that you had seen it. And then, jump forward, when we had kids, I very distinctly remember having Harper, and not the wonderful nurse that helped me deliver Harper, but someone that was helping. Someone made a comment about the color of her skin. Harper was very fair when she was born. And I remember the nurse, a white nurse, being alarmed that she was white and asked, is her skin going to get darker? Because the idea,
How did you respond to that?
I mean, I just had a baby and I'm completely like, but it definitely resonated. Like the idea to this woman that I'm going to hand this Black woman a white baby was something that was difficult for her to wrap her head around.
Well, I think this might be the part as well to talk about, like, okay, so the book is going to be about the South. It's definitely about, like, that Mason-Dixon divide in the 60s and everything that happened. However, in our own courtship, what was kind of interesting about the divide between Dallas and Boston, where we moved after Dallas, was in Dallas, I don't think that we didn't encounter any sort of, like, overt racism or anything like that, right? We would actually, we would hold hands. We didn't like go out to the Dallas Country Club or anything like that.
No.
We didn't go to any like really big white enclave together. but neither were
I mean,
we.
Dallas is a, you know what I mean?
Well, I mean, like we weren't seeking out like the parties in Highland Park. We weren't seeking out society parties or anything.
I
like
was.
that.
I don't know
Actually,
about
you were.
I mean,
actually,
I was.
You were seeking out society parties. That's the
that
thing.
was my job.
That was your job.
That was 100% my job.
Yeah.
So,
So,
again, something you completely forgot about.
But
my
I
life.
remember the thing that we used to do where it would be like, we did feel a little bit, we were welcomed everywhere we went, but like in those years, 2003, 2004, we used to make a game of like, oh, look, another interracial, right? Like
we did another interracial couple.
And it was like, we would say, oh, 3 tables over, another interracial. Like, here we are, we're building in numbers. And it was fine. It was completely fine. And then, and do you know where this is going? Where when we went to Cambridge? Okay, so then we moved to Boston, right? And we're looking for apartments. And do you remember the real estate agent when we were looking in Boston and then in Cambridge? And she was going to show us a couple places in Cambridge. And we were at a bar in Cambridge the night before we were going to go see some places the next day. You don't remember that?
No.
Okay. So I remember this distinctly.
What?
We were like, where should we look? Because we ended up settling in Jamaica Plain.
Yeah, she told us not to live in Southeast.
She said not to move to South Boston, and this is how I recall it. I recall you sort of like knowingly shaking your head, right? Like, oh, I know where this is going. But I was still like, I'm going to question this a little bit. Why is that? And she goes, well, because of who you two are. You guys wouldn't be, welcome in South Boston. And I'm thinking, wow.
I wouldn't be welcome. I mean, that's the message. But here is a great irony, right? Just as a side note, when we moved in, we ended up living in Jamaica Plain. When we moved in, you remember the 2 gentlemen that came and moved us into the house? They were both from South Boston.
They were both from South.
And their accents were so thick that I could not
you couldn't
understand
make it out.
them, right?
And were they kind to you?
I was scared at first because I thought, oh my gosh, like here is what I've been taught to fear. But by the end, these guys were so nice. You remember we bought them beer.
Yeah, I do remember that.
And they sat on the back of the truck and they talked to me forever. And they were the nicest people. And I realized right then, I think, in my own experience, and probably something you realized a lot too as your career progressed and you talked with more people of color, I think, on a more intimate basis for your stories because you had a better understanding. But I learned something right then about, that idea of just being able to connect with people on different levels. Like as a journalist, you're always trying to find that level of connection. You're always trying to, on a deeper level. But I was scared. I was scared. This woman had told us, don't talk to people. And so I think our experience in Boston was just, it's different. Like we're different people. Like I love talking to people. I will talk to anyone.
I found that Boston as a whole was really endearing. Boston doesn't welcome you in at first, but then it begins to welcome you with open arms. And the times we did go to Southie
were amazing.
I thought they were great. There was one time, the St. Patrick's Day parade,
that
where
was frightening.
That was frightening.
But I was pregnant.
You were pregnant, and they were all drunk.
Everyone was drunk.
And we were like, I mean, was there a racial overtone to it? Maybe.
That year in particular, I remember they had, there was a LBGT entry, and I can't remember if they denied the entry or if they.
Yeah,
there was.
I remember there being a story in the Globe about that. Yeah.
But I was like 5 months pregnant, and we
with Harper or the boys.
With Harper, and we were like, "Let's go!" And I think your sister was in town. And
yeah.
We had no idea what to expect, and when we got there, we were like, "This could go sideways any minute," and we're just not prepared.
I think that we fled more because everybody was drunk, right?
Everybody was drunk. It was predominantly
Irish Catholic, white
crowd and a lot of drinking.
Yeah.
And, like as a Black woman, I'm like, all right, no, we got to get out of here. Like something could happen. Like that's just the way that I'm programmed to think. I don't think you necessarily were back then. I think now you are. Like, I don't think if we sat down and have this conversation, like, okay, let's take the kids to South Boston, let's go. We'd be like, no, I don't think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
But back then, I I think, our paths were still converging. Like we share this experience right now, which is the Black experience.
And I think that to bring it back to Meghan and to Harry and to King's vision, it is actually when you have children yourself that experience begins, those dual experiences begin to become one, right? And at least I'll speak only for me. I don't know if you feel this way, but once we had the kids, I began to again, really focus on well, how can I tell them about what it means to be Black children? How can I offer what perspective I can, knowing full well that you'll take the lead on this stuff.
I mean,
right?
but you have 2 boys. You're raising Black men.
I'm raising Black men.
That's a huge responsibility.
And how do you do that, right? So that's hence the reading on the civil rights and all the rest. And just here's the thing that I know that this is really important, but I feel like something that I know that all this discussion of race is really important, but I feel like something that is often overlooked, especially today when identity is obsessed over, is just the fact that in the end, and this sounds so stupid to say it out loud, but yes, you can dwell on it, but in the end, people are just people, right?
I mean, I think you have, and this is how we defer, right? I would love it if we lived in a world where race didn't matter. And fortunately, I think we are blessed with a community and friends where that is not
we don't have to deal with
an issue. Yeah. However, I have to dwell on race because society makes me dwell on race. I need to have conversations
I think
that
you're right. Yeah.
with my kids. Because they're
going to have to have those same conversations. They're going to have to do that.
That's the reality of the world that we live in, right?
Yeah.
And it would be irresponsible of me not to have those conversations. And so as you started to write this book, and as you started to voice frustration with publishers saying, well, I don't think you're qualified to write this book. I personally think, me growing up as a person of color and living in an environment that was at times extremely racist, and having to work even harder for the success or the achievement than my peers, gives me an understanding of my experience that is unique to me. And then, it's hard to explain to someone. I don't think I could sit down with you and say, this is what the Black experience is. You've lived it now for 17 years. You've been there when the woman said, is this child going to get darker?
Well, I mean, the George Floyd thing really prompted me to do this book, right? George was from Houston. George was from Third Ward. George went to the same high school as 2 of your cousins. He went to Yates High.
Yeah.
I remember the 2 of us sitting there when Derek Chauvin puts his knee on George Floyd's neck, and you said that could have been my cousin, and then we both sort of said, well, what if that were one of the boys? And that's when it's like, damn.
Yeah.
What if that were one of the boys?
And that hit you.
That hit me really hard.
Deep, deep place because of your connection, right?
Yeah. I've been telling some friends of mine, some Black friends and white friends, that I don't know if any of your listeners saw this, but after Biden was elected, Van Jones went on CNN and cried. Oh. And the emotion that he felt was the emotion that I felt as well. He talked a lot about the relief he felt as the father to Black children. And I got to say, some Black people or white people may not like it when I say this, but it's the same sort of relief that I felt. I identified with Van Jones.
Well, yeah, because you remember the fear that we felt that during the beginning of the election, the fear that we felt as we, we're navigating what this new world was going to look like for us, for our children, for, our family, for the people that we loved that were of distant nationalities, immigrants. I mean, it was a tough time. And we basically, for a lot of those 4 years, we were scared, a lot of questions, a lot of, And so that relief, because you had a personal connection, if you had been living on the farm in Iowa,
I would perhaps sympathize with Van Jones, but I wouldn't understand
you wouldn't
Van
have
Jones.
had that pang, that deep sense of like, I mean, you know,
Doc
we were
Rivers
both
did this.
crying.
Doc Rivers had the same thing just before the election. It was after one of the terrible shootings. He's like, you know, it's a line that still almost, I almost cry when I consider it. He's like, I love America, and America just does not love me back.
And it's right, like this is,
and I'm like, I understand what Doc Rivers sees now.
You see it.
I see it. I get it.
You see it. You know,
and it took, you know, and it's here's the thing, like, so you know, there's books like White Fragility, which is great. It has a readership, but I don't know that it's necessarily pertinent to our lives. And I don't know that.
I don't think it. I mean, I haven't read the book, but I think your experience, much like I'm sure, you know, I have several friends that are in interracial relationships and raising, you know, biracial children who are amazing parents, you know, and they support their partners and they support their children in ways that, I mean, are incredible, and they would have done regardless of the race of their children or how they identify. And I think what maybe books like that are lacking is just the personal connection that you have to the experience. I cannot academically define every single aspect of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be Black. Mm-hmm. But if you come to my home, you see how we live. You know, I can't dispel, like, you know, one thing my parents would always say when I was a kid, you know, growing up in Texas, so I would come home and I would be upset because, you know, I wasn't invited to a birthday party because I was Black, and I knew I couldn't go because I was Black. And my parents would always say, you know, they don't know you. They don't know us. And that's why, like, you have to forgive that ignorance. And I think in the case of you writing this book, you're not ignorant. You know what I mean? Like, you see truths that a lot of people don't have the opportunity to see just by your life and your existence, you know, and that gives you a perspective that is unique.
I see, and this is going to sound, I see truth, and I also see true heroism. I see true courage in those protagonists from, you know, 1963, Fred Shuttlesworth,
well, yes, and also, you know,
King and
Megan and Mary. I mean, that woman is being persecuted simply because
of her skin,
of the color of her
maybe
skin.
some anti-Americanism as well, maybe,
but she's, I mean, the headlines, the things that they write,
terrible.
The animosity, the vitriol that they have for this woman, you know, and like you said, if you still came from that experience of the small town, you'd definitely be able to empathize. But we were watching that, like, I was in tears.
Yeah,
you were riveted.
It struck very close in the same way that the Van Jones crying struck very close, right? Like, I understood Harry. I understood why he wanted to get his family out of there. I would too.
Yeah, and we never had there was never a discussion, I don't think, where we ever said, I don't think there was ever a discussion where we ever sat down and said, okay, how are our children going to identify? How are we going to teach them?
We just knew that they were going to be Black because America's going to see them as Black.
And so that's, you know, what my parents did for me. That's what their parents did for them. You know, we came from the deep South. My parents, you know, are fair. There are a lot of instances where people either mistake what my identity is or my ethnicity. And I want to make that as clear for my kids as possible. And so do you.
Yeah.
There's no, you know, it's just, there's no discussion about it because it's a truth. Now, granted, it's a truth I wish didn't exist. And like for Megan, that is a truth, you know, with her son who they don't want to give a title to because
ridiculous.
I mean, you know, that's ludicrous. But Harry, you know, to bring it back, is in a position to talk about race now that he wasn't before.
Yeah.
And now that he has a Black child and he will have a black daughter,
Yeah.
he will be in a position and so far removed, right, from that experience that he had, so far removed. You know, you are so far removed from that rural,
Yeah.
you know.
I see the world with new eyes now.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And I've gained this sort of clarity, this new vision, I guess, if you will, over the last 17 years, but really over the last 10, after our kids were born, after Harper was born and then the boys were born.
Well, you know, Harper's 11.
11.
Wait, how old is
Harper's 11.
she's 11? Oh my God. I lost a year. My children are growing up, but she'll be 12 soon. So,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, all right. Well, this is probably a good place to start. I feel like, you know, we'll just have to see, like, if maybe the deeper we go into this book, when we get down to Birmingham, if we find other situations where we should bring this stuff up.
I think definitely as you deep dive, as we start to travel, you know, we'll definitely, I would be surprised if we went down to Birmingham
And weren't struck by something. Yeah.
Birmingham.
Yeah.
I'm struck by Birmingham. But, you know, it'll be fun. Birmingham is Alabama is a beautiful state. It's, you know, it's part of the South.
Yeah, you're going to feel at home.
For
All right.
sure.
All right. The music for Now That's a Great Story comes from one.
Who does it come from? Walker.
Oh, Walker has joined us.
Who does it come from?
No. Jeffrey Willett.
Jeffrey Willett.
And the producer is?
Jeffrey.
Very good, Jeffrey Willett.
Oh, so
All right.
good.
Sonya and I will see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Make sure you. Wait, never mind.
All right. We'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.